The wind blew gently through the park in Villa Esperanza that afternoon, carrying the scent of flowers that stubbornly resisted the neighborhood's dust. Olivia June, with her 7 years of energy and curiosity, ran barefoot across the grass, holding a red balloon in one hand and a piece of bread in the other. The park wasn't big or particularly beautiful, but for Olivia it was the perfect place for her adventures. As she ran, she noticed a man sitting on a distant bench, almost hidden in the shade of a large tree. He looked lost, with dirty, patched-up clothes, disheveled hair, and his eyes fixed on the ground. As she got closer, she noticed something even stranger. There was a cut on his arm, partially covered with a poorly tied cloth. "Hi, mister," Olivia said, tilting her head to get a better look at him. The man raised his eyes, surprised by the girl's direct approach. "You're hurt," she continued, pointing at the cut. "Do you want a piece of my bread?" The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He shook his head, but before he could say anything, Olivia was already beside him, holding out the piece of bread with a disarming smile. "It's okay, you can take it. My mom always says we should help people in need." He accepted the bread with a slight nod, but kept his eyes on the ground, as though her kind gesture made him even more self-conscious. "What's your name?" Olivia asked, sitting on the bench next to him. "Andrew," he replied after a long pause. "I'm Olivia," she said proudly. "I live up the street. My mom works at the big factory. Do you know it?" Andrew immediately knew what she was talking about. He knew that factory very well. After all, he owned it. But Olivia didn't need to know that. Not yet. "Yes, I know it," he said neutrally. "Does your mom like working there?" Olivia furrowed her brow, thinking. "She doesn't talk about it much. She just says it's tiring, but she has to work so we can have food and pay the bills." The girl's words, spoken with the innocence of someone who doesn't fully understand the hardships of adult life, hit Andrew like a punch. He knew the factory had issues, but he'd never imagined the impact his poor management could have on people's lives. Being there in the middle of that community was a choice he'd made after years of isolating himself in his office bubble. And what he found was worse than he expected: neglected streets, exhausted workers, and an atmosphere heavy with a sense of abandonment. As he talked with Olivia, Andrew watched the children playing in the park, some in worn-out clothes, others with patched-up shoes. He knew many of their parents worked for him. Why hadn't he noticed this before? "Are you sad?" Olivia asked, interrupting his thoughts. "A little," he admitted. "My mum says when we're sad, we should think of something good. It helps." Andrew smiled for the first time. "And what do you think about when you're sad?" "The day I'll become an artist and paint beautiful things." The simplicity of her answer made something shift inside him. He realized that this child, who dreamed of being an artist and spreading beauty around the world, deserved more than this limited reality. Before he could respond, a woman's voice called out from afar, "Olivia! Time to go home." It was Evelyn, Olivia's mother, calling her from the other side of the park. Olivia jumped to her feet. "I have to go, but I'll come back tomorrow, okay?" Andrew just nodded, watching as she ran into her mother's arms. Evelyn gave him a brief glance, a mix of curiosity and caution, before turning and leaving with her daughter in hand. When he was alone again, Andrew looked at the piece of bread in his hand, almost forgotten. He sighed deeply. At that moment, he decided it was time to return to the factory, not as a mere observer, but as someone with the power and responsibility to change everything. He didn't yet know how he would do it, but he knew that starting was inevitable. Without realizing it, Olivia had planted a seed in his heart, a seed that would soon grow and transform not only his life, but also the lives of everyone around him. The fluorescent lights in the factory flickered irregularly, casting unsettling shadows on the grimy walls. The constant hum of machinery filled the air, mingled with the muffled murmurs of workers focused on their tasks. Andrew, now dressed as a regular employee, walked discreetly among the production lines. Most people didn't notice his presence, but his sharp eyes took in every detail: poorly maintained machines, exhausted workers, and supervisors who resembled wardens more than leaders. His disguise was part of a strategy. The idea of anonymously entering the factory came to him after his encounter with Olivia June. He wanted to see for himself how things operated when no one knew the owner was around. What he witnessed that morning confirmed the worst reports he had previously heard. In the sewing section, he found Evelyn, Olivia's mother, her hair hastily tied up in a bun and her hands moving swiftly over the fabric. Despite the evident exhaustion on her face, there was a firmness in her posture, a determination that caught Andrew's attention. He approached her, feigning casual curiosity. "Tough work, huh?" he commented, trying to start a conversation. Evelyn glanced up briefly before replying, her hands never stopping. "There's no other way, every minute counts here." Her response was direct, almost mechanical, but there was a note of dignity in her voice that intrigued Andrew. He noticed that other workers seemed to respect her, casting quick glances her way as if seeking guidance. Andrew was about to ask another question when a sharp voice cut through the air. Linda, the factory manager, stormed into the corridor like a whirlwind, the click of her heels echoing against the concrete floor. She was an imposing figure, impeccably dressed but with an icy demeanor that made workers look away as she passed. "Where's the shift report?" she snapped at a nearby supervisor, who stammered something inaudible while handing her a crumpled piece of paper. "Useless, all of you." Andrew observed from a distance, trying to contain the anger rising within him. It was clear that Linda had no respect for the workers. She exuded authority but not leadership. Later, while reviewing spreadsheets in the archive room, the situation became even bleaker. The numbers didn't add up. Financial discrepancies became apparent as he cross-checked operational costs and reported salaries. Money that should have been spent on machine maintenance or improved working conditions was vanishing. Linda had been careful to cover her tracks, but Andrew knew the operations well enough to spot the suspicious patterns. By nightfall, Andrew faced a dilemma. He could fire Linda on the spot and end his investigation, but something inside him told him the problem ran deeper. He needed undeniable proof, not just to address the situation but to understand the full extent of the corruption. He decided to remain in the shadows a little longer. He organized a secret audit, hiring an external accountant he trusted to analyze the financial data. At the same time, he paid closer attention to Linda's interactions with other supervisors. The following week, while monitoring the logs of material entries and exits, Andrew witnessed something that confirmed his suspicions. Linda was in the storage area, quietly arguing with an outside supplier. It was clear the man wasn't there for an official delivery. Andrew discreetly took photos with his phone and recorded the conversation from a distance. Back in the makeshift office he had set up in a disused factory room, Andrew reviewed the evidence he had collected. That's when he received an unexpected visit. Evelyn knocked on the door, her expression hesitant. "Excuse me, I need more sewing threads for our section. We're falling behind and the machines aren't helping." Her voice was firm, but not aggressive. Andrew realized she probably didn't know who he was, yet she still had the courage to approach someone she assumed was a temporary superior. "I'll take care of it," he replied. Then after a brief pause he added, "Have you ever thought about how things could be better around here?" Evelyn looked at him, surprised by the question. After a moment, she answered, "I think about it all the time, but no one listens. Here, we're just numbers." Her words weighed heavily on Andrew. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. Evelyn and the other workers deserved more. With evidence in hand and a growing sense of urgency, Andrew began to craft his plan. He knew confronting Linda directly would only be the start. The real challenge would be transforming the factory into something that truly served the community, and he was ready to fight for it. Sunlight filtered through the factory's dusty windows, but the atmosphere inside was tense. Andrew had spent the past few weeks gathering evidence against Linda, carefully verifying every detail to ensure there would be no way out for her. Financial discrepancies, illicit dealings, and abuse of power were all documented in photos and paperwork. It was time to act. That morning, Linda seemed particularly smug as she walked through the hallway, as if she were immune to any consequences. Workers lowered their heads as she passed, afraid to draw attention. Andrew watched her from a distance, keeping his expression neutral, though inside, he had already made up his mind. Today would be the day of reckoning. After lunch, he called for a meeting in the factory's main office. Linda arrived with a suspicious expression. "What is it now?" she asked, crossing her arms. Andrew remained calm, but his voice carried a firm tone. "I think you know exactly what this is, Linda." He placed a folder on the table filled with detailed documents, falsified financial reports, records of suspicious conversations, and receipts for transactions that shouldn't have existed. Linda flipped through the papers, her face gradually shifting from confident to alarmed. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, trying to regain her composure. "These numbers can be manipulated. You have no idea how things really work around here." Andrew stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "I know exactly how things work here. And I know you've used your position to steal from this company and harm its workers." Linda tried to argue, but Andrew didn't give her the chance. He pressed a button on a laptop sitting on the table, and a recording began to play. It was the conversation she'd had with the supplier in the storage area weeks earlier. Her voice was unmistakable, negotiating a payment in exchange for diverting materials. Linda's expression hardened. "You think you can come out of this on top? I wasn't acting alone. You're stirring up something much bigger than you realize." Her words hung in the air, and Andrew realized she was telling the truth. There were others involved, but for now Linda was the most accessible piece to begin dismantling the web of corruption that had taken over the factory. "Maybe you weren't acting alone," Andrew replied, meeting her gaze. "But you won't be here to continue. Consider yourself fired, Linda, and I hope you're ready to deal with the authorities." Outside, workers began to notice what was happening. News of Linda's firing spread quickly, creating a wave of murmurs and curious looks. Evelyn, who had been watching from a distance, approached Andrew as Linda left the factory amidst protests and curses. "Was this your doing?" she asked cautiously. Andrew hesitated for a moment. He knew it would be impossible to keep his identity a secret for much longer. "Yes, it was," he finally admitted. "And there's more change coming." Andrew decided to reveal his true identity to the administrative team and supervisors. He gathered all the workers in an impromptu meeting on the factory floor. The noise of the machines was replaced by the buzz of curious voices as he climbed onto a makeshift platform to address them. "My name is Andrew Carter, and I am the owner of this factory," he began, his firm voice echoing through the space. "For too long, I neglected my responsibility to ensure this place was a dignified environment for all of you. But that ends today." All eyes turned to him, some filled with surprise, others with skepticism. Evelyn, however, kept her gaze fixed on Andrew, assessing his words. "I know the conditions here aren't fair," he continued, "and I also know that people like Linda abused their authority, harming you and your families. But that's going to change. Today, we begin rebuilding this place together." A heavy silence followed, but it was soon broken by hesitant clapping that grew into a wave of applause. It wasn't applause of joy, but of hope. Hope that his words might finally mean real change. After the speech, Andrew approached Evelyn. "I need someone I can trust to lead this transition," he said, "and I believe you're the right person for the job." Evelyn was surprised but didn't hesitate. "I'll do it, but I want to do it right. If we're going to change, we need to listen to the people who actually work here." Andrew nodded, relieved to have found not just an ally, but a bridge to connect with the workers. Still, as the first steps toward renewal were taken, Andrew couldn't shake Linda's parting words. "You're stirring up something much bigger." He knew there were more secrets buried in this factory, and his fight was far from over. But for the first time, he felt he was on the right path. The transformation at the factory began immediately, but the path was far from smooth. With Evelyn's support as supervisor, Andrew faced challenges that went beyond the workers' initial distrust. He knew Linda's corruption scheme was just the tip of the iceberg, and that dismantling the network behind it would not come without a fight. The days following Linda's departure were intense. Evelyn dedicated herself to listening to the workers, gathering suggestions, complaints, and stories of abuse that had never reached management before. Meanwhile, Andrew began reviewing old contracts and meticulously examining the factory's external partners. That's when he found something disturbing, a pattern of overpriced contracts tied to a name he knew all too well. Frederick, a close friend of his late father and a former trusted advisor, was involved in suspicious transactions. Frederick was more than just a factory partner. He was practically family, someone who had helped Andrew take over the business after his father's death. The discovery was an emotional blow. One afternoon, while Andrew was poring over more documents in his office, he received a call. On the other end of the line, Frederick's voice was friendly, but carried a strange tension. "Andrew, I've heard you're making changes at the factory. Can we talk?" Andrew hesitated. He knew Frederick was likely aware that his schemes were being threatened, but he decided to accept the invitation. The next day they met at a quiet restaurant. "I'm impressed by your determination," Frederick began, sipping his coffee. "But I hope you understand that certain things can't be changed so easily." Andrew stared at him firmly. "Certain things, like the fact that you've been siphoning money from the factory for years." Frederick laughed, but it was a dry, humorless sound. "Do you really think you can change the system, Andrew? This factory is just one piece in a much larger game. If you keep pushing, you'll attract unwanted attention." The warning sounded like a threat, but Andrew refused to back down. "Maybe I can't change the whole system, but I can start by cleaning up my own house. And if you're in the way, Frederick, I'll do whatever it takes to protect the workers and this community." The meeting ended on a tense note, with Frederick making it clear he wouldn't give up easily. Andrew knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but he no longer doubted that he was on the right side of the fight. Back at the factory, he and Evelyn began implementing visible changes. Old machines were repaired, shifts were reorganized to reduce worker exhaustion, and wages began to be reassessed. However, not everyone welcomed the improvements. Supervisors who had benefited from Linda's schemes started quietly sabotaging the new processes. One night, Andrew was urgently called to the factory. A fire had broken out in one of the production areas, destroying part of the inventory. Evelyn was already there when he arrived, helping to organize the workers and ensure no one was hurt. "This wasn't an accident," she said, her face smudged with soot. "Someone's trying to scare us." Andrew knew she was right. The fire was a clear message that his efforts wouldn't be tolerated by those who had something to lose. Even so, he refused to back down. The next day, he gathered the workers once again. "What happened isn't a sign that we're losing. It's proof that we're on the right track. They're afraid of what we can achieve together." Andrew's words reignited the workers' determination, but he knew he would need more than speeches to protect the factory. He hired a security team to monitor the premises and strengthened internal controls to quickly identify any sabotage. Meanwhile, Evelyn stood out as an indispensable leader, mediating conflicts among workers and proposing ideas to improve efficiency without compromising health or well-being. Her ability to inspire trust was undeniable, and Andrew began relying more and more on her experience and intuition. Frederick, however, didn't stand still. He began using his political and business connections to pressure Andrew. Key contracts were suddenly cancelled, suppliers withdrew, and rumors about the factory's instability spread throughout the city. Andrew realized Frederick was trying to financially isolate the company, forcing him to give up. But Andrew had an ace up his sleeve. Using the evidence he had gathered, he filed a formal complaint against Frederick and the other accomplices tied to Linda. At the same time, he sought support from the community of Villa Esperanza, presenting his vision of a factory that truly served the workers. The community's support was immediate. Inspired by Olivia June, who helped paint murals on the factory walls depicting unity and hope, the residents mobilized to defend the business. Local shopkeepers offered discounts to workers, families began organizing events to raise funds, and even neighborhood children participated, writing messages of encouragement for Andrew and Evelyn. Despite the threats and challenges, Andrew felt that something was changing. The factory, once seen as a symbol of exploitation, was beginning to transform into a source of pride for Villa Esperanza. Yet he knew the final showdown with Frederick was still ahead, and the factory's future would depend on what came next. The sun was setting when Andrew arrived at the factory that evening. The golden light seemed to reflect a moment of transition, but to him it was merely symbolic. The past few weeks had been a constant test of endurance, and the attacks from Frederick and his allies showed no signs of slowing down. However, Andrew felt he was finally beginning to see the bright side. The workers were united, and the community's support was growing stronger by the day. There was no turning back now. That morning, Frederick had used his political connections to secure a meeting with local authorities. He spoke of the factory's potential bankruptcy and supposed financial troubles, conveniently leaving out the schemes he had orchestrated himself. His strategy was clear: pressure Andrew until he was forced to sell or shut down the factory. But Andrew knew that wouldn't be enough to destroy what he had begun to build. When he entered the meeting room, Evelyn was already there, seated at the table with neatly organized papers in front of her. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but also determination. "Have you heard the news?" she asked before Andrew could say anything. He nodded, closing the door behind him. "Yes, Frederick is throwing everything he can at us, but we can't let it shake us." Evelyn looked at him with a smile that showed more confidence than she truly felt. "We won't, but I've been thinking, we need to take a more aggressive approach. If we can't prove his connection to the fraud, he might get away with it." Andrew took a deep breath. He knew Evelyn was right. He couldn't allow Frederick to walk away unscathed. He had done the impossible to try to save the factory, but it was clear that time was running out. "We're ready to act, Evelyn. The evidence we've gathered is solid, but we need more. We'll expose his entire network. We have the strength of the community behind us. I'm counting on that." The plan began to take shape in that room. Over the following weeks, Andrew and Evelyn coordinated a quiet but relentless movement. They contacted investigative journalists and hired attorneys specializing in corruption cases. The evidence against Frederick continued to mount, and this time, there was no denying his role in the factory's embezzlement schemes. Meanwhile, the situation at the factory was gradually stabilizing. The production lines were running more efficiently, and the improvements to workers' conditions were already showing visible results. Olivia June, with her innocent and inspiring vision, helped paint a mural in the cafeteria depicting a tree with deep roots, symbolizing the strength of community and unity. Neighborhood children often came by to help, transforming the once oppressive space into a vibrant and cheerful environment. What had been a place marked by exploitation was now becoming a symbol of hope. However, the tension escalated as Frederick realized his network was beginning to unravel. During a dinner at an exclusive restaurant with some of his allies, he could no longer hide his frustration. His threats became more explicit. "If he keeps this up, he'll ruin everything. We need to stop him before it's too late." Frederick was furious, but he knew things were slipping out of his control. He resorted to more direct methods, threatening local business owners and manipulating contracts to further weaken Andrew's position. But the community, now deeply engaged in the fight, responded with even greater strength. When suppliers tried to pull out, the residents of Villa Esperanza mobilized and offered support, ensuring the factory's operations continued. It was a silent war, but Andrew and Evelyn were determined to win. In the final showdown, as the corruption case was about to reach the courts, Andrew received an unexpected visit. Frederick, now desperate, showed up at his house. He knew he had nowhere left to run. The web of corruption had been exposed, and his downfall seemed inevitable. "Andrew, I know you're going to report me. I made mistakes, I know that. But you have to hear me out. We can work together. I know how to fix this. I still have power." Andrew wasn't fooled. He studied Frederick for a moment, considering his words. But he knew that giving in would only perpetuate the corruption he had worked so hard to dismantle. "There's no place for people like you anymore, Frederick. Your power is gone. You've been ruining lives for far too long. Now it's time to do what's right." Frederick fell silent, his empty gaze reflecting his imminent defeat. He knew the fight was over. That same night, Evelyn was called to a meeting with local investors. The factory had become a symbol of renewal and commitment to the community, and now the doors were open for a partnership that would secure its continued operations. With the support of the city and the strength of the community, what once seemed like the end was now the beginning of a new chapter for Villa Esperanza. The factory had finally become a place of renewal, not just for the business, but for everyone who depended on it. The corruption was defeated, but the greatest triumph was the emergence of ethical leadership focused on collective well-being. Olivia June, with her murals and simple dreams, was the soul of the transformation. In that moment, Andrew looked out at the city in the distance, feeling a weight finally lift. The fight was won. The legacy of Olivia and everyone who believed in change was only just beginning.